In the aftermath of the meetings in Saudi Arabia between the United States and Ukraine, now then the harder work begins to trying to get an agreement between the United States and Moscow. That's going to be a lot of difficulty. It was a difficult path to get Ukraine to even agree to a ceasefire, because they had been trying to get an air and sea ceasefire only. They didn't want to stop fighting on the ground for various reasons that they wanted to. But then it looked like the Trump administration kind of put the screws on the negotiators in private, and then they came out agreeing to it. So that was hard, but the real one's going to be, can we get the Russians to agree to it as well? And to try and get to the bottom of a lot of this, we have Colonel Doug Macgregor back with us, highly decorated combat vet, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. And Doug, just kind of what are your thoughts? And let me actually start with what you thought in terms of the Jeddah meetings themselves in Saudi Arabia between the United States and Ukraine.
Well, I thought it was an odd place to meet with the Ukrainians, but at this point, whatever we can do, whatever we like. The difficulty is as follows: the Russians regard us as the ones who are in charge, and rightly so. We're the ones that have provided the vast majority of support, of equipment, of information, intelligence. And so their expectation is that if we really want this thing to end, we, that is the President of the United States, will end it, period. The notion that we should be negotiating or have to negotiate with the Ukrainians over very much is something I don't think they take seriously. The other thing is that we have this bad habit, Dan, and you and I have seen this over the years. People go into a talk, conference, negotiation, they come out and say, oh, we have a breakthrough, this works. Well, just because one side agrees to a ceasefire is not a breakthrough. It would have been better had no one said anything, and then let Washington's delegation present the outcome to the Russians and find whether or not this is acceptable to them. Now, I don't think it is. I don't think it's going to be. And they have continually resisted the notion of accepting a ceasefire. So I don't know what the expectation is at this stage. It seems as though we're drilling a dry hole, to put it bluntly.
And that was some of the things that Rubio and Waltz said coming out of the meetings in Jeddah themselves. And then today, Rubio actually gave an expanded view on where they think the situation is and where it's going to be going.
Like any country in the world, Ukraine wants their long-term security. They want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. We all do. I mean, what is the point of spending all this time to get a ceasefire, hopefully, and then a negotiated end of the war, only to see it re-spark up again in about 6 years, 4 years, 3 years? We're not interested in that, and they certainly aren't either. So I think the question really is more about a deterrence. Can Ukraine create a sufficient deterrent against future aggression, against future attack, against future invasion?
Now, that's going to be a big challenge here. I mean, first of all, agreeing to a ceasefire is one thing. That's 30 days long for the Ukraine side. But I think the real rub is going to come in not just whether Russia agrees to a ceasefire, but what kind of terms they want on an end of war negotiation. Because it's hard for me to imagine the Ukraine side coming out of this with the ability to be able to have a powerful deterrent to keep Russia from coming back in the future. How do you see that part?
Well, I think the surest deterrent, if you want to call it that, is to sign on for, without question, neutrality for Ukraine. End of discussion. That whatever emerges on the map in the future that we call Ukraine will be neutral on the Austrian state treaty model. And there was no thought about deterring the Russians from invading Austria. Once that treaty was signed, the Soviets left. And they didn't come back, and they had no intention of ever returning. And by the way, they were only just over the border inside Hungary. So they could have easily come back at any point in time that they wanted to do so. I think we're missing that, the whole point of neutrality. And then secondly, what are we doing? We seem to be intent on sustaining this war. We are continuing military aid and assistance. Now we're going to provide sensitive intelligence. For what purpose? So that the Ukrainians can launch more long-range strike drones or missiles that will kill Russians inside Russia? Is that our goal? Because if that's the goal, that is not going to produce peace. It's not going to produce an agreement of any kind. We are the ones that are in control of Ukraine. We can step in, we can stop the Ukrainians in their tracks right now, ceasefire, back off, and put an end to the war. We're not doing that. We're actually making it easier for whatever is left over there, and there's not much, to continue the war. And more important, we're adding insult to injury. We're saying, well, you can't do anything on the battlefield, but you have these devices that allow you to fire hundreds of kilometers into Russia. Well, go ahead and do it. It doesn't make any sense, Dan.
And really, the question is going to be, how is all of this going to contribute towards bringing it into the war? You've had President Trump has just been outspoken since 2023 and all the way through, and everything he said, even in as recently as yesterday, that's exactly what he wants to accomplish. And he's always focused on the right things, which is to prevent pointless deaths, both Russian and Ukrainian. He said he has been sharply focused on that. He is aggrieved by it, and I certainly applaud him for that. But then the question is going to be, will these policies actually get us there? Here's what he said yesterday in regard to where he wants to go with this.
I think it's a big difference between the last visit you saw at the Oval Office and this. So that's a total ceasefire. Ukraine has agreed to it, and hopefully Russia will agree to it. We're going to meet with them later on today and tomorrow, and hopefully we'll be able to wipe out a deal. But I think the ceasefire is very important. If we can get Russia to do it, that'll be great. If we can't, we just keep going on and people are going to get killed. Lots of people.
Now, what do you make of that last statement there? Because he's talking about getting the ceasefire, getting an end of war negotiations, et cetera. But then he tags it out by saying, but if we don't, then the fighting will just continue. Is that maybe an indication that he realizes that it's going to be hard to get something from the Russian side, or how do you interpret that?
The Russians have said from the very beginning that they would not accept any ceasefire before negotiations. They're happy to sit down and negotiate, but there will be no ceasefire until the negotiations produce an agreement that everyone can live with. So the notion that the ceasefire is a precondition for an agreement is dead in the water. So all he said is, I guess we're dead in the water, which is a very, very unprofessional response at this stage. The Russians have laid out the conditions. They have been made very clear. Those conditions are easily picked up and read anywhere by us or anyone else. Zelensky is going to continue doing whatever he does with his band of thugs in Kiev to attack and murder Russians with whatever he's given. That's his goal. He's going to go down with a ship. We shouldn't be subsidizing that. The president is right. We don't want more Russians or Ukrainians to be killed. By the way, neither does President Putin. So the first step that we need to take is cut off all aid to Ukraine, period. We already know that most of it, if not at least half of it, has ended up in a black hole of corruption and criminality in Ukraine. Stop sending it. Then get all of us, I mean Americans, in and out of uniform, members of the intelligence organizations, the people serving over there, get them out. Everybody leaves. When those things happen, the Ukrainians will sue for peace, and the Russians will sit down and they'll begin to hammer out an agreement. But again, there doesn't seem to be an appreciation for the fact that you keep talking about ceasefire, and for months and months and months, the Russians have said, no, thank you. There will be no ceasefire. We will negotiate, but we're going to fight while we negotiate. We're not going to accept anything until the fighting is over. And the ceasefire is not the first item on the agenda. That's the last item. So I don't know how you resolve it other than to say, well, then let's go back to the drawing board and look again at the conditions that Moscow outlined. I think that's what they should go back and do, Dan.
Do you think that there's any possibility that, yes, Russia's been saying that, but maybe there's some option that the U.S. administration can offer them that would get them to change their mind? Because as you've said, this has been going on for a long time. And here's one of the more direct denunciations of it from Sergei Lavrov in December.
What we need is not just a ceasefire. We need peace, a long-lasting peace. we cannot be satisfied with empty talk. So far, all we've heard is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce. And it's not particularly hidden that this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine. A truce is a road to nowhere.
So if from the Russian perspective, if it's a road to nowhere, can you conceive of any diplomatic offer that the U.S. Team could offer Russia that would get them to say, okay, well, I'll tell you what, we'll do a 30-day ceasefire and then talk something else?
End all military aid to Ukraine immediately. The United States suspends it all, period. Not to be reconsidered, reevaluated later, period. It's over. We stop all aid to Ukraine, number one. Number two, we get all of our people out of Ukraine, all of our forces, whatever is in there that is American, leaves. And if we do that, the rest of the NATO allies will follow suit very quickly. That's clear and unambiguous to the Russians that we're serious. At that point, I think the Russians would consider any number of things, but that's critical to meeting their conditions. The concern in Russia is that at every turn, this regime in Kiev, with its radical neo-Nazi backers, will look for every opportunity to resume fighting. And therefore, what is the point of a ceasefire if it's simply going to be treated as rest, refit, reorganize, so that you can come back again and threaten Russia? It's that simple. And I don't know how you get around that. If I were a Russian, I would take the same position.
Well, so let's look at the Russian part of this calculation. They have been saying that clip that I showed you there from December, both Putin and Lavrov, Sergei Ryabkov has reinforced that. We actually had Larry Johnson on the show, I think it was yesterday or day before, where he physically went to Moscow along with Judge Knapp, and they actually had a meeting with Sergei Lavrov. And that was the one thing he said they really emphasized to him, was that they were still not interested in a ceasefire. And that was actually before that. The meeting they had with him was right before it had been agreed in Jeddah that the Ukraine side would agree to that. So one just has to wonder what is the next step there, and what will the Russians do if the Steve Witkoff apparently is heading that direction right now. When he gets in and meets with Putin, is Putin just going to say, I hear you, but y'all don't seem to be hearing me? How do you think that meeting's going to go?
I don't think it's going to go anywhere. If we insist on an immediate ceasefire and say, well, the Ukrainians are willing to ceasefire, well, of course, Ukrainians' backs are up against the wall. The regime in Kiev is on its last legs. There's no question about that. But as long as they are receiving aid from us, as long as we are still on the ground in Ukraine, providing the intelligence, the technical expertise, whatever is required to sustain these long-range strikes against Russia, the Ukrainians are going to continue. There is no evidence for any good faith on the Ukrainian side whatsoever. And I think that's what Lavrov and Putin are saying. So again, we're the ones that created this war. Without us, there would have been no Ukraine war. We're the ones that staged this coup and installed a government that otherwise would not have come to power. We're the ones that subsidized the building and structuring of a Ukrainian force that had one purpose and only one purpose: to attack Russia, to retake Crimea, but to march into Russia. This was a machine that was fueled with more than money and cash and technology. It was fueled with hatred on a scale that we haven't seen for decades. That's all unacceptable. If we signal that that's over, we make it very clear that we've had it with that. We will not subsidize that anymore. And that's something that President Trump can do easily because he was never part of it. The longer he waits, with each passing day that we dither and refuse to take decisive action, cut the aid, pull everybody out, the more and more this looks like President Trump's war. And that's not a good thing. It's a drain on our resources, time and effort, and it still has the potential to expand. That's what's most disturbing. So we really need to stop it. How do you stop it? Stop the aid to Ukraine, pull us all out, and then talk to the Russians. Right now, we have not demonstrated that we're willing to do anything. We're instead acting as though we're the victors strategically in this conflict. We're not. Neither is Ukraine. And we're trying to dictate the outcome to Moscow. It's not going to work, Dan.
So what could the administration do? What's the best thing they could do right now to get the maximum benefit for the United States that won't undermine, I guess, our diplomatic credibility elsewhere? For example, many people are already saying, yeah, if you don't agree to this ceasefire, talking about the United States, if you don't get Russia to agree to this ceasefire, then you, quote, have to keep supporting Ukraine. Otherwise, you will be abandoning them and handing over to Putin a victory. How do you respond to that?
Russia has already claimed victory in eastern Ukraine. It's theirs. They hold the initiative. They can move strategically in any number of different directions. We talked before about the concentrations of force in eastern Ukraine, down in Kherson, all the way to Zaporizhia, and up north in and around Kharkov. They can move as they wish at Putin's command. And there's nothing that we can do about it unless we want to declare war on Russia. I don't think we do. I don't think anybody is interested in that. So the notion that if we don't get X, then we have to support this is ridiculous. We don't have to support this at all. We shouldn't support it. We should never have supported it. And that was Trump's brilliant opportunity to step forward and say, I have no interest in subverting Russia. I have no interest in destroying Russia. I have no interest in using Ukrainian lives, blood, and treasure, even though they've got none, to destroy Russia. That's not my goal. My goal is peace. So the first step in that direction is cut the aid and pull us out. Get us out of there completely. And the other Europeans will then subsequently follow. That's tangible. That's real. You do that, and the Russians are going to say, well, I guess they're serious. They really want to stop this war. And then you sit down and you negotiate. And I think it could be done. But the way we're approaching this, it's becoming it's got to be a win for me. If I can't get a win out of this, if I don't look like I'm winning, then I can't do it. Well, this is a situation in which we're not winners, and we're not going to be winners, and Ukrainians are certainly losers. There's no question about that. We ought to be more magnanimous. Remember, when Teddy Roosevelt negotiated an end to the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese wanted far more control over Manchuria and much of eastern Siberia than the Russians were prepared to give. And President Roosevelt said, look, you've won. The Russians concede. You have won the battlefield victories. Now you can afford to be magnanimous and generous. Don't demand too much. And I think I can get you most of what you want. That's exactly what happened. And the war ended, and it didn't break out again until really 1939. So the point is, there's a way to do this, but we're not approaching it reasonably. We're trying to take the position that, well, we're the United States, we're the great hegemon, and you've got to do these things or we won't play. The Russians are going to say, fine, then we're not playing. And they will continue to move in whatever direction they want to secure whatever it is on the ground that they want.
Now, let me ask you a question on in terms of the Russian military capacity. So there has been this view in the West for really all of the last full 12 months, more than that, probably 14 months, toward the end of 2023, that Russia, yes, they've been moving along to the west. They've been taking territory, but it's relatively short. It's relatively small because that's all they can do. That's the best that they can get done. And then we've seen from, I think it was the 8th of March up until just last time I checked earlier today, there has been a dramatic shift in the Kursk area where it appears that Russia just made an operational decision that they are going to now close off the Kursk pocket. Now they call it the Suja pocket. And they had just moved huge numbers of kilometers, of square kilometers every single day. And now then it could literally be expunged within 2 to 3 more days here. Is that indicative of what Russia could do elsewhere, or do you think that was unique to the Kursk area?
Well, first, we need to admit that in this Kursk Oblast, there's almost nobody there. Very few people live there. You're talking about vast stretches, hundreds of square miles of forest, dense forest. There aren't very many improved roads. So the only people that were there that were fighting were obviously Ukrainian or mercenaries that were fighting for the Ukrainians. They've decided to put an end to it. I think that's the way it should be viewed. And I think as soon as they do it, they'll be ready to move on in new directions. I don't think we should apply that everywhere. What takes 1 or 2 days in Kursk might take a week elsewhere. It depends on the density of force and the nature of the terrain. That terrain was open and largely empty. That's not the case as you move west in Ukraine. I think the bottom line is the Russians can do pretty much what they want. Pretending that the Russians are somehow or another incapable doesn't do any good. I mean, we got to stop this nonsense of pretending that we are somehow or another innately superior to everybody else. That's ridiculous. You know, I don't think the U.S. forces right now could have gone 100 kilometers without falling all over themselves and sustaining themselves logistically. You know that from your own experience. We're not built to do it. We're not organized to do it. We were much better 30 years ago than we are now. And it really wasn't that good 30 years ago. We were just facing an enemy that didn't have the opportunity to launch deep strikes that could have had a profound impact on us. So I think all that crap needs to go away. We need to stop talking about that. And eventually the Russians are going to say what they've always said to people when they come to the negotiating table: put up or shut up. What is it that you're going to put up? If you refuse to do X, Y, and Z, show us. And I don't think we're prepared to do that at all.
So what do you think will happen in the, let's just say the Kursk area? Let's stick there for the moment. Do you expect that the Russian current offensive there, the Akhmet group, I believe it is, and several other units too, are going to move to reestablish the border and then stop there, or will they continue going into the Sumy Oblast?
It's hard to tell. It will depend on the operational decisions made at a higher level. Remember that the Russians have made it pretty clear that they're not really interested in governing Ukrainians. In other words, the areas where they are established are Russian areas with Russian people in them. As you move further west, even up in the northern part of Ukraine, you start running into Ukrainians, and obviously they're not interested in being governed by Russians. So again, the Russians are not fools. They know who lives where. They understand the consequences of their actions. That's why the notion that somehow or another they must accept a ceasefire on our terms based upon what the Ukrainian opponent, which is essentially destroyed in most cases and can only launch long-range strikes as vengeance attacks, wants to do. Forget the Ukrainians right now. Let's look at where the Russians are, and let's say, okay, we understand your conditions. We are going to do the following: suspend all aid, pull all of our technical and intelligence and military advisors out of the country. We're getting out. We're going to do that. So now let's look at the remaining conditions. And I think you're going to get much further with the Russians.
I want to take a look at what some of those conditions are. We mentioned several times the June 14 lines. That's from last summer when Putin made some declarations here. That has some big ramifications right now. So first of all, I want to show, in case anybody has missed it, here's what Putin actually said last June 14th.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
Now, I want to zero in on a couple of things he's talked about there. Let me show you the map first, because these areas here in the gray area, these are part of the Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the Luhansk area. Most of Donetsk is already in the Russian control, but there's large swaths that are still under Ukrainian control. Russia has said, and they repeated again just a month or two ago, that that's still the conditions, that the minimum conditions they'll have is that the Ukraine has to withdraw from all of these areas. Then it's also important what he said, Gary, if you can throw that up there, because he also said something about demilitarization. That kind of got passed over by a lot of people, but there was a Russian official in December, late December, that actually quantified what that was. Here's what he put up there. Gary, if you can put that in. This was published by the Institute for the Study of War, where they reported what he said. And the key part of that was, it says Russian Federation Council Speaker Valentina Matvilenko stated on December 24th that Russia is open to compromise and negotiations with Ukraine. That's good. But the Russians will strictly adhere to the conditions it laid out during the negotiations in Istanbul in March 2022, when the Russian troops were advancing on Kiev and throughout the eastern Ukraine. Moldova added that the Russia would not deviate from these conditions by one iota. One of the very specific things mentioned in there was that they would only allow a force of 85,000 Ukrainian troops to be a provincial border force, etc. Well, they're somewhere around 800,000 now. So for us to get the fighting stopped, for there to be negotiations, we would have to agree, and then Ukraine would have to agree, that they will reduce by 90% all of their troops. Do you see any chance that they would actually agree to that?
Yes, I think so, but not Zelensky and his crew. These people have a different agenda, which is to sustain this conflict as long as possible. Again, go back to the Austrian State Treaty. You had an outcome there that was quite similar. The Austrians ended up with a very small army, which was really largely paramilitary, and they were granted neutrality. They were granted the opportunity to govern themselves as they saw fit. And the Russians agreed, or the Soviets agreed at the time, that there would be no interference in the internal affairs of Austria. They could develop independently. It worked. I see no reason why that would not also work in Ukraine. So I don't think that's unreasonable by any stretch of the imagination, especially when the Ukrainians have lost over 1 million dead and the Russians have lost roughly 100,000 dead. I think everybody has an interest in putting this to bed once and for all. And the Russians aren't going to live with a 500 or 600,000 man army armed to the teeth, focused exclusively on Russia when the war ends. So that's nonsense. So no, I think it is doable, but it's not going to happen with Zelensky and his crowd. Again, go back to this denazification. I think Zelensky and his friends ought to be viewed as being in that category. If you're going to denazify the place, you've got to get rid of them. We should be interested in getting rid of them too. Why do we want to sustain a state that has any connection, no matter how remote or modest, to the National Socialists who were there in 1943, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48? We don't want it. So we have no interest in that. So I don't have a problem with the conditions that the Russians have stipulated, and I'm quite confident that they'll abide by those. But again, you want an agreement that we can sign along with the people that border Ukraine. In other words, the Poles, the Slovaks, Moldova, Romania, Lithuania. They should all sit down, and we should. And by the way, the Germans, who have a long-term strategic interest in the region, they too should be co-signatories. And if they do that, and we do that, and the Russians do it, it'll work. I'm quite confident of it. The underlying argument against this is always the same fiction. The Russians want to conquer Europe. No, they don't. Who in their right mind wants to do it? Why? To drink a latte in Paris? Look at the mess that Europe is in right now. Who in their right mind would want to have to manage it? It's the last thing in the world the Russians are interested in.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that they don't have the capacity. And from a lot of the sources I've talked to, one of the reasons why the Russians are fighting so hard right now is because they view this as an existential fight on their border for their own national security. But to go in and conquering European territory, which is presently not posing a threat to them, I think would be a lot harder of a pull. But so here's the big question, though, that I got. Let me run back to the map here. So this is the current situation as of today. This is just really the shocking part. Like I said, how fast the Kursk area has fallen. You see, there's hardly anything left in it now. Russia continues to take almost all of Suja, and then there's nothing but a bunch of forest. There's, I think, a couple of villages down around here, and then the rest of it is just forest. So it's probably not going to be long at all before Russia reestablishes the control, which takes away what was alleged to have been, and I think you and I both argue it never really was, a leverage point for the Ukraine side. But now then they don't even have the fiction because they have physically lost it. But they do still have these here. So if Ukraine, and it's not even the United States, if Ukraine doesn't agree to give up this territory willingly, what do you think the Russians are going to do, and over what time frame? Would they be willing to continue on fighting even if it takes another 6 months, 9 months, a year?
Yes.
And do you think that it would take that long?
I don't know. I don't know. Again, everything really is contingent on us. As soon as you halt military aid and assistance to the Ukrainian state and you withdraw all of our advisors, military advisors, intelligence advisors, technicians, get them all out, I think the entire Ukrainian house of cards will collapse. There's nothing left. So I think that's the key to ending the war. And I don't understand why we won't do that, because this argument that there's something legitimate about Zelensky and his regime is fundamentally false. His regime is more oppressive and more objectionable and obnoxious morally than I think almost any other that I've seen in many, many decades. We shouldn't be supporting it under any circumstances. So I think we need to send that signal back to Moscow. And remember something else, and this never seems to come up for discussion, which is so depressing. Russia is a Pacific power. Russia is a Central Asian power. Russia, for all intents and purposes, because of its reach into the Caucasus, is practically a Middle Eastern power. In other words, Russia is more than just a European power. Under those circumstances, Russia can be enormously helpful to us in terms of our strategic interests, what we want to achieve. And we seem to ignore that. In other words, this enormous benefit to the United States, the American people, to cooperate with Russia. That's what we should be thinking about right now. That's where we need to focus. President Trump is too good of a businessman to do otherwise. He needs to stop and recollect that very carefully, because it's terribly important.
So now then the question is, what do you think is going to happen in the near term? So we know that Steve Witkoff is heading to Moscow right now. We saw what the Secretary of State Rubio apparently wants to categorically view. We've had the Russians that said, yeah, sure, come on up. We're willing to have a negotiation and talk. But if everybody holds to the positions that they are right now, that we want a 30-day ceasefire, that the Ukraine wants basically security guarantees, and that the Russians say, we want this territory here, those are irreconcilable. So how do you see this going here in terms of what's going to actually happen once we start to go into the next round?
The good news is that President Putin and his government want to talk to us. The good news is that the Russian government and its businesses across Russia want to do business with us. That's all good news. We should keep that in the forefront. The bad news is the ceasefire insistence is dead. Forget it. There will be no ceasefire. Look at the conditions. How do we meet these conditions? And the key to meeting those conditions is what I've said before: end the aid and withdraw people. If that doesn't happen, I don't think much will change, except that the map, excuse me, the map will probably be altered, and the borders will be further advanced to the west.
Well, that's a pretty dire situation if you're fighting in a Ukrainian uniform right now, because this doesn't seem to be going in a direction that would seem to be successful to get this war over with soon. My only hope is that President Trump remains firm in his convictions that he wants the war to come to an end. And he does seem to be, in that clip we played from yesterday, he seems to be aware that it's not a guarantee, and that if things don't go well, the fighting will continue on. And then he may be in a position to do exactly what you suggested, which is then, all right, well, I'm not going to fund the continued destruction of your country. We're going to end of all of our stuff here, which ironically could probably bring this to an end much quicker. But I guess all that remains to be seen. We'll have to see what happens with the next round of this.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, I guess that's our show for today. We want anything to get this war over with as fast as possible, because I'm sharply focused on this pointless death that's been going on for way, way too long. But like you said, I'm glad that the Trump administration is trying to find an end to it, as opposed to the previous administration, which just wanted to keep the war going on its own course, and that the Russians are willing to talk to us. At least there's something to work with there, and I hope we do have some kind of positive outcome.
Agree. I think it's a perfect summary, and I think President Trump can do it.
He can. He definitely can. He's the only one who has a possibility of doing that, and I certainly pray that that's exactly what does happen. But thank you for coming on the show today, Doug. Always a treasure to have you on here.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
And thank you to you guys too. Thanks for coming out today. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that. By the way, we're also on podcast. I know a lot of you don't have time to watch video all the time, but you do want to keep up with Daniel Davis Deep Dive because we're unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth. And I know a lot of you really like that. Just look wherever you get your podcast, type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you'll find us waiting there. In the meantime, we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.